Welcome students to the week one, module one discussion. The purpose of this is to just add a little bit more to the information that you find in the module there. There is a fair bit of information there as well, and quite a few readings, which will help you, particularly with the first part of assessment task 1. So we're going to be talking about the forestry and timber products industry in Australia, stakeholders and legislative frameworks. Now, when we talk about forestry, we're talking about the growing and harvesting of timber. And then when we talk about the timber products industry, that starts with the processing of timber. So that's kind of like your traditional sawmills, but also then goes down the line. And, the broadest definition really goes all the way through to businesses that manufacture using timber in Australia. So that's fairly broad. So when you start to think about it, it's a fairly large industry. Okay, so a snapshot of the industry. So in terms of total forest area in Australia, there is currently, and these are fairly recent figures, I've got the source down the bottom there from ABARES, the Australian Bureau of Agriculture and Resource Economics and Statistics. So currently there's about 134 million hectares of total forest area in Australia, and that's 17% of our total land area. And when you sort of look at that, that's a very, very large number. So let's just break it down a little bit though. Okay, so when we actually look at what is available and suitable for commercial wood production, that actually drops considerably. So that comes down to 28.1 million hectares. And the reality behind that is Australia is a very dry continent. And so a lot of the forest area that we have is actually very dry forest. And one of the main issues there in terms of, the sustainability of forestry is the time that it takes to regrow trees after they've been harvested. And in particularly dry areas, that's a long time. So it really does cut down quite a lot what is available. So in terms of public native forests that are available and suitable, again, we go all the way down to 6.3 million hectares. And then you've got leasehold and private native forests that are available and suitable. And that's interestingly, that's where most of that area is 21.8 million hectares. In terms of log volume, 32.9 million cubic metres of timber is harvested every year in Australia. That amount does go up and down a little bit. And of that, the vast majority is commercial plantation log. And we'll look at that, in a little bit. The vast majority of that is radiata pine plantation. So when we talk about native log, and that's often the one that's quite, politically controversial, it's 4.2 million cubic metres. So it's a relatively small proportion of the total harvest. And there you go. So in terms of logging and wood manufacturing, it employs roughly 76,000 people in Australia. I think those figures go back to about 2017, but there wouldn't have been a significant change since then. And the value of the industry is around about $23.9 billion to the Australian economy. All right, so here's a sort of a map that shows the breakdown of Australia's forests and what type of forests they are, where the trees are growing, and you can kind of see, quite obviously, it's more in the coastal areas, different species in different areas, but it's mostly coastal. An interesting graph here in terms of the forest area change. And you can see that there's been a decline there since 1990. And, presumably if that went back further, you'd probably still see that declining, almost from when European settlements started. But an interesting thing started to happen around about 2008. and that is the area under forest started to increase again. I wonder why that might be. Okay, so now when we go back to our map and we're looking at it a little bit differently now, this is sort of now looking at whether it's commercially viable or not. And so now you can actually see a massive difference to what we saw, a couple of slides ago. So here you've got, you can see on that all other forest is this grey. And really, if you look at the map of Australia, most of it's grey. So most of what you saw there as forest is actually not really commercially viable for harvesting. And then when we go through our assess commerciality, you can still see that the very low and low actually constitutes the vast majority of what's left over. So when you start looking for the yellow, the green and the blue, particularly when you're looking at the map of all of Australia, there's really not a lot there that you can see that's appropriate for commercial harvesting. And then, of course, when you get in a bit closer with some of those blow-ups there, you can see that actually most of the very high commerciality areas are located in New South Wales between Coffs Harbour and Sydney, just on that coastal fringe there. And then going further south, you can see south of Sydney on the coast, up in behind Eden, and then down along the Victorian, the eastern part of Victoria. And that's pretty much it, other than a few sort of areas up around in the hinterland between Cairns and Townsville. There's a bit in Tasmania as well, and some around Western Australia, particularly down south of Bunbury. So really, again, when you break it all down, yes, there is a lot of forest area in Australia, but very few of it is of any use, from an industry perspective. Okay, so let's talk about plantation forests. And remember that graph we saw, a few slides back where we saw forest cover in Australia decreasing, then increasing again. We might, start to see, where that's coming from. So plantations are intensively managed stands of native hardwood forests or exotic softwood forests, tree species. So when we're talking about hardwood, we actually talk about that, that what is a hardwood in next week, in week 2. But hardwoods will be mostly native Australian trees like blue gum, spotted gum, brush box, and in Tasmania, blackwood and Tasmanian oak. And then in terms of softwood, we're talking mostly in Australia, we're going to be talking about radiata pine, which is in an introduced species. And that's usually if you go, into the hills behind the major cities, you'll often find radiata pine plantations. Certainly west of Sydney around Oberon, there's significant radiata pine plantations. And again, down south around Tumut, there is as well. So the primary purpose of commercial plantation forestry is wood production. And when we're going back and talking about radiata pine, most of that is for framing purposes, generally for housing construction. So our total commercial plantation area was just under 2 million hectares in 2017-2018, and half of that was softwood. So about half of that was radiata, and then the remainder was hardwood. Victoria is the largest area of plantation timber, followed by New South Wales, then Western Australia. And Western Australia has the largest area of hardwood plantations. We have the largest area of softwood plantations. And again, like I said, that's mostly radiata pine. And the vast majority of the log harvest, was from plantation forests. All right, so let's have a look at plantation area by type. And so what you can see in this graph here is you can see that softwood plantations have been fairly static in Australia. Hardwood plantations have increased, But from about 2008 onwards, they've been fairly static and to some extent decreasing slightly. And again, you can see that reflected in the next graph where the new plantation area in Australia from 2011 onwards has basically not changed. Now, that's a really interesting sort of thing to notice. One of the things when you talk about issues in the industry is that the demand for timber in Australia goes up and up and up, and particularly for the construction industry. Yet the supply has now remained pretty static. Now, one of the big issues here, and this is kind of like where it gets a little bit challenging, is that when politically, when we're sort of looking at these issues of climate change, clearing or preparing native forests or cutting down native forests for the purposes of then planting plantation forests is a fairly politically charged topic, and so it's not one that politicians are really happy to allow, and that pretty much can explain a lot behind the fact that despite the need for more timber to be grown in Australia, we're actually not growing any more timber in Australia, in 2023 than we were particularly in a decade ago. Okay, so this kind of links back to when we're talking about climate change, some of the positives and negatives relating to climate change. But this is kind of like this is where forestry is a potential key to some of the solutions that we'll be looking for around climate change. And of course, so during photosynthesis, and we do cover that a bit more next week, forests absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and they store it in biomass. So one of the things that has been recently clarified by scientific research is that the carbon that is physically in timber comes mostly, nearly all of it comes from the atmosphere. When trees grow, they do not absorb particularly large amounts of carbon out of the soil in which they are growing. Most of the carbon that makes up the biomass of trees actually comes from the atmosphere. So when we're talking about the fact that we've got carbon dioxide levels increasing in the atmosphere, actually being able to grow more trees and store that carbon in that biomass is potentially a good thing. So like it says there, a significant amount of carbon is stored in wood products. So again, you build a house with timber framing, that carbon has been sucked out of the atmosphere, goes into the tree's harvested, and that's actually locked away in the building. So when we look at that, it's in 2016, 22,000 million tonnes of carbon was held in Australia's forest in harvested wood products in service and in landfill. So that's a very, very big number there. So nearly all of that was in living forest. And 94 million tonnes of carbon was held in wood and wood products in service, which was an increase of 11 million tonnes. So it just sort of shows, even though by comparison that's a much smaller number, it just shows that that is a growing area, and that's possibly or hopefully a good thing. So reductions in national forest carbon stocks are caused by forest clearing for agriculture, urban development, wood harvest from production forests, and natural disturbance events such as bushfires. And we're going to talk a bit about bushfires because that's becoming increasingly an issue. And increases in carbon stocks occur in forests that are regrowing from past disturbance events such as fire or wood harvesting and following planting events, afforestation and reforestation. All right, so bushfires. They can cause loss of human life and destroy trees, livestock, buildings and power lines, but also lead to soil erosion, degrade water quality, And also the natural regrowth can reduce water yields as well. So they have sort of fairly massive impacts. Now, between 2011 and then right through to 2016, the cumulative effect of fire or area of fire was 105 million hectares. So that's a pretty significant amount when we go back and look at that original number in terms of how much of Australia is forested. And most of that was actually up in Queensland and the Northern Territory. But we do need to talk about the 2019-20 fire season, because that was not only a massive event for Australia, but actually a massive event globally in terms of fire. So in that one event, 8.3 million hectares of native forest was burnt and 130,000 hectares of plantations burnt. New South Wales was particularly hard hit. So you can see the breakdown there in those graphs there. So you can see here, here's some information about, how significant that particular fire event was. So you can see the native forest there and the native forest in fire extent, and you can see how the vast amount of that was in New South Wales. And it actually had massive effects on areas of the industry, particularly spotted gum plantations. Okay, so let's move on. So one of the things it wants you to look at, like in the assessment task, is to just have an awareness of legislation and industry frameworks. And I'm using Victoria as a case study for a couple of reasons. I wanted to because I know that most of you are in New South Wales and Queensland. So, for your own research and for the assessment task, you can look at the legislative frameworks for your state. But the other thing too is actually the website for VicForests is particularly good. So there's some of the information on there is actually going to be relevant for the assessment task anyway. So there's a few acts of parliament in place that help with the management of forests in Australia. So we've got the Sustainable Forests Act of 2004, and it provides a framework for sustainable forest management and the sustainable timber harvesting in Victoria's state forests. Now, the thing when we talk about sustainability, I've got a separate little mini lecture in there in week 1 that talks about sustainability. It defines it, but then it also discusses it a little bit further in the context of the industry in Australia. So make sure you do have a bit of a look at that. And then pursuant to that act, the minister may make an allocation order that specifies the area of forest available for timber production. And then the allocation is in the form of the total area of 2 broad forest types available to Vic Forests. So it's kind of interesting from that point of view, because again, we talk about the politics of forestry, and you can very much see that the minister still has a great deal of control over what and how much forest actually is available for forest production. And I suppose, from a political point of view, they would probably want to have that control, depending on, what side of government they are, and also just what way the winds blow politically. Because unfortunately, it is a very politically charged issue, and for many good reasons. And it's not just about climate change, but, we're talking about habitats for different kinds of animals that are under threat. Which can be very emotive topics, particularly when elections come around. And then there's a sustainability charter, and most states will have something like that, which sets the direction for sustainable forest management in Victoria. It commits the department and various department agencies to being able to sustainably manage the industry in Victoria. Now, the thing with sustainability, when you think about the people that rely on jobs in the industry, and the towns, particularly rural towns that rely on employment, having a sustainably managed industry is actually desirable for a wide range of stakeholders. So when we talk about stakeholders, we're going to be talking about, obviously there are governments as stakeholders, there are industry as stakeholders, and so for example, the construction industry in Australia would be a stakeholder in that they have an interest to ensure that the forests are managed properly so that they have a continued supply of materials. But also, individual people are also stakeholders. So a good example would be, if you were you ran a petrol station in a town like Oberon in New South Wales, or in a place like Omeo in Victoria, you would also be a stakeholder to an extent, in that your business would actually rely on the fact that people are employed in the area, in the industry, and they're also then using your business to support them. So it really means stakeholders can actually be defined quite broadly. Okay, so other aspects that are important is research and development. So research is a fundamental component of good forest management. Science-based decision-making should be at the forefront when considering forest practices and the best way in which to manage forest values. Now, Vic Forest acknowledges that research is an integral component for developing successful, conservation outcomes, while also taking into account the social and economic needs associated with forest management. So they do sort of fund research and development. However, sometimes good science, again, can become subservient to political expediency. And then stakeholder engagement. So, I discussed that just a minute ago in terms of defining what stakeholders are. And you can see here that when Vic Forests are discussing stakeholders, they're talking very much about communities and community relationships. So that's a very important element. And again, you can see sort of the political expediency there. So aims to make people aware of planning processes. And they're very involved in different communities across the state. So and you can see there, Vic Forest recognises that many groups have strongly held views about the harvesting of publicly owned native forests. So and I've taken that information directly from Vic Forest. So you can see that it is a focus for them. Okay, so that's really all I wanted to discuss here. Obviously, back in the module, there's a lot of information there for you. Do take time, particularly with the readings for this week, because that will, along with all of the other information that's in there, and along with this discussion here, and feel free to do additional research to support your approach to this area, particularly, linking it to the state in which you are. And that should help you very much to get through the first half of Assessment Task 1. Now, next week, Module 2, From Trees to Timber, Understanding the Living Organism. Now, in next week's, we're sort of going back to the fundamentals of trees, how they grow, their properties and characteristics, right through to timber harvesting, and the different characteristics of different timbers. So there's a lot there in the module, but there's also some fairly substantial recorded lectures that I put up there, which also further support what's in the module.